Welcome to this online lesson on slavery, life on the plantations and slave resistance. We're going to look at two crucial aspects of the slave trade and slave society. The aims therefore will be to know how slaves are treated on reaching the Americas and to explain how plantation conditions could lead to slave revolts. This is where slaves would fight back against their owners. Some key terms then, and I recommend that you write these down if you're not familiar with them, especially within the context that we'll be using them today. A plantation was a farm on which slaves worked. Resistance means pushing back or fighting against those in power. And a revolt or rebellion is where people fight back against their rulers or masters. This is a form of resistance. Note down those key terms and the title, and when you're ready, we'll continue. But for now, you can pause the video. We're going to start by having a look at a photograph. This photograph is actually very unpleasant, so be prepared for that. First thing I'm going to ask you is, how do you feel when you see this picture? You can write this down or you can just think about it. The picture's coming up now. What has happened to this slave? What do you think this slave did to be treated like this? And do you think that this was common? In other words, did it happen regularly? Note down some answers, or just give it some thought. You can pause the video now. Well, I don't know how you feel when you see that picture, but I can tell you that I'm pretty disgusted by it. It's never a picture that I like looking at. I can almost feel the pain for myself. So what has happened to this slave? Well, all of that disfigurement on his back is the result of whipping. Being whipped didn't just hurt, it could split open the skin on your back, and as it scarred over, or in this case as it struggled to scar over, it would leave very heavy disfigurement on the skin. So what did the slave do to be treated like this? Well, it is likely, in fact certain, that he didn't do anything to deserve this. Slaves could be whipped like this for any number of things, depending on how cruel their masters were. Perhaps the slave escaped and they wanted to teach them a lesson. Perhaps they weren't working hard enough. Perhaps they answered back. Whatever it was, this is a very brutal treatment. So how common was this? Well, it depended what plantation you were on. Some plantation owners were perhaps kinder to their slaves. Now, I don't mean that in the sense that there were kind slave owners, because obviously that's a contradiction in terms. If you own slaves, you are by definition not kind. But they're often more concerned about damaging their property, because remember, that is how slaves were viewed by their masters. And then there were others who did not consider their slaves to have any value at all, hardly. And so brutal treatment like this was just seen as another measure by which they could be controlled. Whatever, this is a cruel circumstance, and slavery itself is cruelty. So this gives us a little bit of an insight as to what the slave plantation conditions were like. Some slave plantations were probably worse than others, but all slave plantations by definition were bad. First of all, we need to consider what happened to the slaves when they arrived after the Middle Passage. If you've not yet done my lesson looking at the slave trade, you might want to have a look at that first before you continue on to this aspect of slavery. There were two main types of slave auction. First was the auction itself. Slaves were paraded in front of buyers and examined like cattle. They were then made to stand on an auction box and buyers would bid for them. They were sold to the person who paid the most. Unsold slaves would die without food or water, or possibly be sold at a different sale. Then there was the scramble. The slave trader would set a fixed price for his slaves. At a given signal, usually a horn or a drum beat, the buyers would rush into the cage and grab the slaves they liked the best. You can see why they called it a scramble. At this point, I've included a link within the description of this video to another clip from the TV show Roots, which shows the sale of slaves. This is done fairly realistically, and it includes racist language which is absolutely not acceptable today, but is a realistic portrayal of how some people spoke at the time. You should watch this video if you're comfortable doing so, and then consider, does it show an auction or does it show a scramble? Pause the video now if you want to watch that link first, and then we'll have a look at what type of sale it was. Alternatively, just wait a few seconds and we'll proceed. Those of you who watched the video should recognise that that was a slave auction. The slaves, both the boy and the girl, were treated like animals. The buyers inspected their teeth for signs of disease and their skin for signs of blemishes from the very long and torturous journey on the Middle Passage. You can also see that they are very unhappy with this. It's a humiliating and dehumanising experience. Some follow-up questions then. Explain how each of these auction types worked. To do this, you'll also need to describe the way that they worked, and you've got the information on screen to help you. Secondly, why might there have been different styles of auction? Give that some thought, write down your answer, explain it, and then when you're ready you can press play. But for now, you can pause this video. So hopefully you've been able to explain how each style of auction worked. But why were there different types? Well, firstly, the sellers would usually get more money from an auction. They would also be able to talk about the individual so-called attributes of these slaves and try and get the best price from them, much as someone selling an animal would. Again, this is all part of the horrible dehumanising process of slavery. However, this would risk some of the slaves going unsold, which would harm the profits of these people, and that's what they were worried about. Unfortunately, of course, it would also harm the prospects of the slaves themselves. In terms of the scramble, if they just wanted to sell all of their slaves very quickly, this was the best bet to do it, but they might not make so much profit individually. However, if there was a shipment of slaves that perhaps wouldn't fetch a good price otherwise, this is something that they would turn to. Notice at no point have I been talking about the well-being of these slaves being in the forefronts of the people's mind. Far from it. The slaves were being treated as property. Again, I've used the word dehumanising, but this is a process by which they are treated as being less than human and made to feel less than human, a truly distressing way to do things. Here's how slaves might be described before the sale. This source here shows an actual advert which was published in Jamaica in 1787. A slave called Jimmy fetched £330. He was a good carpenter in his prime. At the same auction, a slave called Butler only fetched sixpence, about 2.5 pence. He was described as very indifferent fellow with bad legs. Have a look at this source. What does this source tell us about what the slave owners valued in their slaves? To give you an idea, £330 would be in today's money several £1,000s, and sixpence or 2.5 pence in modern pennies, well, that wouldn't be worth quite as little as that, but we would only be talking about a few pounds. Pause the video while you answer the question. Clearly, the slave owners are treating these people like animals. They're looking for ones who are in good condition, so have not been harmed too badly by the Middle Passage, and who are able to work hard. However, if they're in any way disabled, such as the indifferent fellow with bad legs, they wouldn't be able to work so hard on the plantation and they would fetch a much lower price. Most slaves would fetch one of the higher prices, but the lower priced slaves were still people, and it again just reminds us as to how devalued these people were and how dehumanised they were. What did it mean to own a slave? In the picture we can see a typical slave owner's house. This would have been owned by the white master and his family, but would have been staffed by black slaves. Often younger slaves or women would be tasked with these roles, or older women too. Landowners in the British colonies of America and the Caribbean were there for only one reason: money. They were growing expensive crops like tobacco and sugar on large farms called plantations. Again, it's worth looking back at my video on the slave trade if you're unclear as to what the economics of this was. These products were in demand in Europe and would fetch high prices, but this wasn't enough for the slave owners. Slave owners wanted to get more profit by not paying their workers, by using slaves. We're going to consider now what the rights of slaves were in 1764. In short, they didn't have any rights, which is why I've put the word rights in inverted commas. But instead, a sort of code of basic rules and rights was formed by the slave owners. And you can see just how little human value is put upon these people. Slaves are property and can be sold. Masters can do as they like with their slaves. Masters must destroy slave culture. What is meant by that is the sense of an individual slave identity and language. You'll notice that Jimmy from our earlier slide would not have been his real name. He would have had a different name in Africa, but slaves were given new names to help destroy the culture that they had come from. Slaves were given new names, as I've mentioned, and slaves can be killed, as in a master can kill the slaves without any punishment. Slaves cannot marry, and slaves cannot be educated. Slaves must be locked up at night. Slaves must wear a ball and chain. Slaves cannot become Christians. Slaves cannot possess property or sell anything. All blacks are slaves. And slaves' children are the property of the master. So in other words, if a slave was pregnant when bought, that child would then be another slave of the master when they grew up, assuming that they did in the harsh conditions in which they lived. Your tasks then. Clearly slaves had no rights. They were treated as property. Choose examples from the bullet points that show A. that slavery was racist, B. that slave owners feared slaves fighting back, and C. that slaves were treated like animals. Explain how your chosen examples show these things. So you'll need to write down the example, say what it meant, and then explain how that shows that, for example, the slave owners feared the slaves fighting back. Secondly, why might white slave owners have come up with these so-called rights or rules? Pause the video now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Perhaps the most obvious example that shows that slavery was racist is the blanket statement that all blacks were considered slaves. This meant that this was a racial divide, and so that anyone who was a person of colour would be automatically considered a slave. Although this changed later on, this meant that there was no such thing as a free black person under these rights. There were freed slaves later, but this is from 1764, which is somewhat earlier on, and at a time where the colonies of America, for example, were still ruled by the British Empire. What about an example that shows that slave owners feared the slaves fighting back? Well, consider the ones that physically restrained them, slaves being locked up at night and slaves wearing the ball and chain. This would make it physically difficult for slaves to fight back, but there are less obvious ones too. Slaves not being able to possess property or sell anything means that they cannot raise money and they cannot trade for things like weapons. Lastly, that slaves were treated like animals. Well, it's the idea that none of the usual human rights that apply are actually taken on board here. The idea that they do not get any education, that they cannot marry, and that you can simply kill them like property would apply perhaps to a farmer's livestock, but here it is being applied to human beings. So why might white slave owners have come up with these rights and rules? Well, they wanted to restrict the freedoms and rights of their slaves and actually codify that so that all slave owners were doing this. That way, there couldn't be this sense that some slave owners were kinder than others in some way and that they should all be playing by the same inhumane rules. Remember that none of this is done for the benefit of the slaves themselves. Far from it. It's done to harm them. We're going to consider slave society and structure now. Society in slave states and on plantations can be represented in diagrams like these. And so, as we might have seen with diagrams that are similar in appearance to this, like for example the feudal system in medieval England, the higher up the diagram, the more power that group had, but also the smaller it tended to be in size. Slave society as a whole then consisted of white Europeans at the top, freed slaves where this was possible, mixed race slaves, and African slaves. On the plantation itself, at a more individual level, you had the owner at the top, who would have been a white European. You had drivers, who were often mixed race, but not always. You had skilled workers and servants who would be doing specific skilled jobs on the plantation, and you would have unskilled field labourers just doing the heavy work at the bottom. What I must stress to you, though, is that it's only the people at the very top, the white Europeans, who had any real rights or freedoms at all. Now your task is to simply draw your own version of these triangles in your books and to add pictures and colour if you have time. because after this we're going to be looking in more detail as to what sort of work they did on the plantation, and that'll take the form of a research task. So get this down first of all, and pause the video while you do so. Okay, let's have a look at our main task. Plantation life and the slave revolts. This is a research task that you'll do fairly independently. You can now conduct your own research to extend your knowledge of slavery. Part 1 is on life in the plantation. You could complete this as a mind map, as a booklet, or simply as structured notes on paper within your book. Perhaps you could produce a poster on your computer. It really is up to you. But there are certain things that I will need you to get on there if it's going to be a meaningful piece of work in detail. You should include the work that male and female slaves did, the way that slaves were treated, what products the plantations produced. For example, in the picture here, we can see the cutting of sugar cane. As an extension and to add a bit more challenge, why might British consumers have ignored the suffering of slaves when buying the goods produced by slave plantations? After all, lots of people even by this time liked sugar in their tea. But were they concerned about where that sugar came from? Some were, but for the most people, it wasn't a concern. Then we have part 2. This is where the slaves fight back. There were several rare but notable incidents of slave rebellions and revolts. Some smaller slave rebellions were really quite common, but they were put down quickly. So most of the ones that are remembered and recorded in the historical record are the big ones. I would like you to choose at least 2 slave revolts. You can then explain what caused the revolt, who was involved, and that means the people who were involved. For example, you might want to focus on the leader Toussaint Louverture, who was a slave revolt leader, and what the result was. As an extension, you can explain how far you could think the conditions on slave plantations from part 1 led to the slave revolts that you've concentrated on in part 2. And also you might want to consider the causes of the revolts in that as well. So where can you get the information? Well, there are books available, sure, but if you're working from this video, I've included a link in the description to a couple of different resources. There's a short BBC educational video on the matter, which is a good introduction to it. You can make some notes on this and re-watch it if you need to. Then there's a more detailed several pages article on the BBC website that I've also linked as well. This provides more detail about the slave plantation conditions, but also crucially gives us good examples of slave revolts. You've got about 6 to choose from on there, so you should be able to choose 2 specific slave revolts from that. However, if you need more detail, then do by all means do a web search for this. But be careful only to use websites that you recognise and websites that are clearly educational. You don't want to fall into the trap of getting any misinformation from this, especially over a topic which can be occasionally distressing. So things like School's History and Spartacus are good places to start. Okay, so that is your main task. You'll want to spend probably about 20 minutes per section at least. So consider this the main part of the lesson, taking anywhere between about 40 minutes to an hour. Obviously, I'm not going to just keep the video going on for that length of time, so you can pause it here while you complete your work. Do it properly, get the specifics down, and illustrate it if you have time. But remember, you're dealing with a difficult topic here, so we really owe it to the history that we're studying to do this well. Good luck. We're going to conclude by looking at the legacy of slave ownership. This means what slave ownership has left behind. This can be something of a sensitive topic, and here's why. Traders in Britain became very wealthy from slavery, and this helped enable the Industrial Revolution and the improvement of some living conditions in Britain. Not to ignore, of course, the suffering that brought too. But, in short, white British people profited from the suffering of black African slaves. So what legacy has this left behind? Well, the truth is much of the legacy is quite well hidden, but when you scratch the surface you can find it. Sometimes the most impressive old buildings in town were built on the profits of slavery. Some very worthy causes and famous local amenities were founded by families that became wealthy from slavery. One of the things that helps illuminate this is when slavery was abolished at the beginning of the 19th century, and that means when it was got rid of, The British government compensated those people who owned slaves. In other words, they said, if we're going to ban slavery, we will give you money so that you don't feel like you've lost out on profits. Surely something that's hard to understand today, but actually only reasonably recently have these particular pieces of compensation finished being paid. So here's how you can find out a bit more in your local area. As a follow-up task, you could do this. You don't necessarily need to write anything down, but you could just explore it. Visit the UCL Legacies of British Slave Ownership website. I've included a link in the description to this video. The University College London did a huge amount of research about Caribbean slave plantations and their owners back in the UK. You'll find that actually there are a tremendous number of them all over the country. You'll see that most communities in some way had a link to the slave trade and profited from it. The town where I'm recording this, a town called Great Torrington in North Devon, which only has about 6,000 people living in it, actually has 2 entries from the end of the 18th century of people being compensated for slavery. 2 people in a small town. So that means that even in a small town without direct links to ports was profiting from slavery. If it was true in a small place like Great Torrington, I imagine it was true in many other places too. And you'll see this for yourself on the map if you click on the link in the description. So think about this. You could write something down, or you could just give it some thought. How do you feel about the idea that your local community may have profited from slavery? And I don't mean today, but I mean in the past, which might have a knock-on impact upon society today. This isn't an easy question to answer, and again, there's no wrong answer here. You might be distressed by it. You might not think it matters, but just give it some thought anyway. But in particular, remember this. I'm not berating anyone who's alive today for the profits that people had back then. What I am asking you to think about, though, is the fact that many of these profits still leave a reminder in society today. And perhaps we should recognise that. So remember, the actions of people in the past are not your fault, but they did happen, and it is worth reflecting on the effects. Once you've done that, that will be the end of the lesson. I hope that you found it useful and interesting. If you have, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a difficult topic, this, and I wish that I was there in person to discuss it with you, because often when you're dealing with difficult periods in history, that's the best way to learn about it, to overcome any misunderstandings, and to clarify anything that I've said that you've maybe misunderstood as well. So if you are able to contact me and you need to, then please do so. If not, I'll say thank you very much for now, and goodbye.